question: what is Dwight Eisenhower's legacy as president? We're going to take a look today at Dwight Eisenhower, not as the commander of the D-Day invasion, but as President of the United States. There are many contradictions between Eisenhower, we'll take a look at it. So let's take a dive in. The first thing on Eisenhower's agenda in his first term is to end the Korean War. And so one of the first things he does is goes over to Korea, which was a campaign promise that he fulfilled. He goes to Korea and he ends the war. We end up having an armistice. Now, an armistice, though, is just an end to hostilities. There wasn't a treaty, and so no treaty was signed. Therefore, the war didn't technically end. In fact, it still hasn't. That's one thing that is always kind of an odd caveat to the Korean War. It's not technically over, which always was a sticking point. The next thing that happened in East Asia, at least in Southeast Asia at this point, was in Vietnam, or what was known at the time as French Indochina. The French fought a battle against the North Vietnamese at a place called Dien Bien Phu and lost. And all of a sudden you had something that looked very much like the Korean Peninsula in a north that was run by communists, and a south that was essentially nationalist, but was more of what would become actually more of a kind of a fascist dictatorship. Now, Eisenhower claims that he didn't want to get us involved, but we do, and he cites what he calls the domino principle. And this is the idea that if one country falls to communism, countries around it will fall as well. It doesn't hold up when you start thinking about it, but this is what Eisenhower uses to justify getting involved in Vietnam. One of the major issues that Eisenhower is going to have as well in his first term is the Middle East and access to oil. The United States already had a handshake agreement between Franklin Roosevelt and the Saudi Arabians, which had been continued by Truman and then, of course, Eisenhower afterwards. But Iran was also a place where the US and England, or Great Britain, was getting their oil. All of a sudden, a democratically elected government comes in, they nationalize the oil, take it over. All of a sudden, these London and New York companies are out. And so, Eisenhower decides to send in the newly formed CIA to overthrow the government and set up a guy named Shah Pahlavi. The overthrow of the democratically elected prime minister will have repercussions that continue to this day. The last thing I want to talk about in Eisenhower's first term, at least involving foreign affairs, and in so much that it involved the Cold War, was the COG, or the continuity of government. This was essentially a shadow government that Eisenhower sets up that, in the event of a nuclear war, would be able to step in. It's made up of senators and congressmen, and then also private businessmen from around the country. They would go and they would just set up the government, or set up their own government and essentially run it as a dictatorship. If you ever get a chance, the book is Raven Rock that I found this information from. It is a fascinating read, and it takes you from Truman all the way through to the modern day. So we still have this in place. While this was going on outside of the United States, things were starting to shake up domestically as well. Eisenhower had a lot on his plate, but the biggest program that he wanted to push in his first term was the Federal Highway Act. This laid over 42,000 miles of interstate highway across the country, was one of the biggest infrastructure projects in our country's history, and changed the way people traveled. You no longer took winding roads, you no longer took national highways or state highways. If you wanted to get from one place to another really quickly, you jumped on the interstate. Beyond the Federal Highway Act, the rest of Eisenhower's first term, at least domestically, would be outside of his control, but as president, he would have to deal with them. The first was something that I guess was sort of in his control, and that was the naming of Earl Warren to the Supreme Court. He wanted to be on the Supreme Court even though he had no prior experience. He had been the governor of California, but had never been a judge. So when the Supreme Court Chief Justice stepped down, Warren was nominated and approved and became one of the most influential Supreme Court justices, and the Warren Court itself was one of the most influential Supreme Courts in this country's history. It starts out in 1954 when the Warren Court overturns the doctrine of separate but equal. This is the doctrine that states that as long as things are equal, they can be separate. Well, there is no such thing as separate and equal. And that's what Brown v. Board found. What Brown v. Board did was make segregation illegal in education and therefore illegal everywhere. And this would set up the next really 20 or so years of the civil rights fight. Following up on Brown versus Board, you saw the Montgomery bus boycott during Eisenhower's first term. Now, for most of the country, this was the introduction to Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and the like. But for Eisenhower, he saw this as more of a distraction. He was not a integrationist at all. In fact, his view of Warren's decision was that it was a distraction. He didn't like it. And this is something that has tarnished his legacy. With foreign and domestic issues piling up, Eisenhower's second term is one that is going to be very forgettable. Eisenhower's second term is one mired in controversy. First, you have the Little Rock Nine. This was a group of students who were trying to integrate Central High School in 1957 in Arkansas, but the governor ended up sending in the National Guard to try to stop them and actually harass them, and it wasn't until the students' lives were in trouble that Eisenhower sent in the military to follow these kids around and let them go to school. This was seen as too much by one side and too little too late by another side in the country. It's again outside the scope of this particular video, but we'll come back to it later. It's a fascinating story in and of itself. But the Little Rock Nine showed just how out of touch Eisenhower was with the general public. Another issue that showed how out of touch Eisenhower was the launching of Sputnik. It's the first man-made satellite to be launched into space, and it was done by the Soviets. Eisenhower didn't see it as a big deal. In fact, the United States had the capability, but Eisenhower saw it as a Soviet propaganda tool. But it worked. The people of the United States start to lose their minds and want Eisenhower to do something about it. But when the United States fires up their first satellite, it crashes back to Earth. It looks at this point like the Soviet Union is leaps and bounds ahead of the United States, and Eisenhower is going to take the blame for it. Finally, two major issues happen in the last year of Eisenhower's presidency. First, Cuba falls to communists under the leadership of Fidel Castro, and now you have a communist nation 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The second major incident that takes place is the downing of a U-2 plane over the Soviet Union, which was spying for the United States. Eisenhower initially rejects that this actually happened, but it comes out later that, yes, the U.S. did actually do this, and while Eisenhower publicly was trying to put on a face of peace and trying to lower tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, all of a sudden that just goes away because you have this spy plane that's been downed. The last thing I want to talk about today is the military-industrial complex speech Eisenhower gives during his farewell address. He basically gets up in front of the cameras and says, our military is way too big. We spend way too much money on it. It's larger than what we had in World War II, in World War I, any war, really. It's massive. we spend so much money on our military. The thing is, he gives this speech in 1960 when John Kennedy, who's running for president, is saying increase the budget for military, and Richard Nixon, Eisenhower's own vice president, is also saying we need to spend more on the military. It is unfortunate, I think, that Eisenhower doesn't feel the need or the moral strength to do this. And I don't say that knocking Eisenhower. I respect Eisenhower greatly. He was an amazing leader. But it does show you a little bit of what politics does to somebody.
Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president.
From his ending of the Korean War, to getting us involved in Vietnam, to naming Earl Warren and Warren's Brown versus Board decision, to his waffling on civil rights, from his intervention in Iran to the speech on the military-industrial complex, Eisenhower is a man of contradictions. Which leads us to our original question. How should Eisenhower's presidency be remembered? What is his legacy? We'll see you next time on Question of History.
Now is the time for all good Americans to come to the aid of their country.